The man drove slowly into the neighborhood, the late sun casting long shadows across the street, his eyes heavy with the thought of rest, but his mind still alert to the details around him. The quiet houses, the trimmed lawns, the sense of order that the HOA always forced like a chain over everyone's lives. As his car rolled closer to his gate, he noticed something unusual fluttering in the wind. A piece of paper taped roughly to the iron bars, the edges curling, the letters stamped in bold red. His heart sank even before he stopped the car, because he knew that color, he knew that tone. He had seen it before on other doors, on other mailboxes, and it was always the same, an HOA warning. He parked, stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes, and pulled the paper free, the tape tearing harshly as if it had been slapped there in anger. His eyes scanned the words quickly, and though part of him expected the usual nonsense, grass too long, trash bin out too late, this one made him stop, his brows furrowing, his breath catching in disbelief. The letter read in cold, printed letters, "It has come to our attention that you intend to drain your pool. This action is not permitted without HOA permission. Violations will result in fines and potential legal action." For a moment he just stood there, the paper trembling in his hand as he read it again and again, his lips curling into a bitter laugh, a laugh without humor, sharp and dry. How could anyone claim control over what he did with his own pool, his own water, his own property? It was absurd, insulting, like telling a man when he could breathe. He crumpled the paper slightly in his fist, shaking his head as the laugh slipped into a mutter. Ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Who do they think they are? But even as he mocked it, even as he told himself it was just another one of their petty power games, he felt something different in this letter, something heavier, a tone of threat that pressed harder than usual, as if this was not just another warning but the beginning of something bigger, something aimed directly at him. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the street, and there she was, Karen, the HOA president, standing near her porch with that familiar stance, arms folded tightly across her chest, lips curled into the smirk that always seemed carved into her face, her eyes locked on him with the sharpness of a hawk. She didn't wave, she didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The message was in her stare, in the way she tilted her chin slightly upward, daring him to defy her, daring him to make a move she could pounce on. His jaw tightened, his fists curling around the letter, and for a long moment he stared back, a silent battle in the heavy air, neighbors peeking from windows, from behind curtains, pretending not to watch but always watching, because whenever Karen made a move, the whole neighborhood held its breath. Finally he turned away, pushing through his gate, the paper still clutched in his hand, and as he walked toward the house he felt her eyes burning into his back, following him until the door shut behind him. Inside, the air felt heavier, the silence thicker, and he tossed the letter onto the kitchen table with a sharp flick of his wrist, the crumpled paper skidding across the surface, landing near the empty fruit bowl like a piece of trash. He paced the floor, his steps quick, his voice muttering to himself, "Absurd, absolutely absurd, my pool, my water, and they think they can tell me what to do." His eyes drifted toward the back of the house where the pool sat just beyond the glass doors, the water glistening faintly in the fading light, calm, silent, his pool that he had paid for, cleaned, maintained, enjoyed, his pool that no one else had any right to touch. He pressed a hand against the glass, staring at the water, imagining the pump, the rush of it draining, the freedom of knowing it was his decision, not theirs, and in that moment his anger turned into something colder, sharper, a promise to himself that he would not bow, not this time, not to them. He sat down finally, forcing his body to stillness though his heart still pounded, and he picked up the letter once more, reading it slower now, noting every word, every threat. The fines meant nothing, the HOA loved their fines, they printed them like confetti, but potential legal action. Those words carried weight, a weight that felt deliberate, like Karen herself had leaned over the draft and insisted they be there, like she wanted him to feel the noose tightening, wanted him to believe she could summon the law itself to crush him. He folded the letter carefully, not tearing it now, not discarding it, but sliding it into a drawer where other warnings sat stacked in neat, angry piles, a record of every petty war they had tried to start with him, a collection of paper weapons that had failed before and would fail again. Yet this one, this warning about the pool, it pulsed louder in his mind, and as the evening grew darker he found himself returning to the window again, staring at the water shimmering under the glow of the porch light, and in the reflection of the glass he saw his own face, hard, set, determined. Across the street Karen's lights flickered on, her shadow moving past the curtains, and he knew she was watching, waiting, ready to strike. But he also knew one truth that steadied his breath, one truth that kept his anger from turning into fear. This pool was his, and no letter, no threat, no smirk from across the street could change that. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet he sat alone at the table, the letter's words still echoing in his head, and though he told himself it was absurd, though he mocked it with bitter laughs, he could not deny the feeling in his chest, the sense that this was no ordinary warning, that Karen had set her eyes on him now more than ever, and the war that began with a single piece of paper was only just beginning. The night was heavy with silence when the man finally decided he would not bend. He would not let a single sheet of paper taped to his gate decide what he could or could not do on his own land. And though the warning still burned in his mind, its red letters pulsing like a challenge, he felt something stronger than fear, a stubborn resolve that wrapped around his chest and pushed him forward. He waited until the neighborhood was quiet, until the last porch lights flicked off one by one, until even the sound of dogs barking faded into the distance, and then he stepped outside with steady steps, moving through the cool night air toward the pool in the back. The moonlight spread across the water, turning it into a silver sheet that rippled gently, calm and harmless, yet somehow now it felt like a battlefield, the very center of the war Karen had declared. He stood at the edge for a long moment, staring into its depths, his reflection staring back at him, and then he moved, retrieving the pump from the shed, dragging the hose across the stone path, his movements slow but determined, each scrape of the hose against the ground sounding louder in the stillness of the night. He set the pump into the water, the quiet splash echoing, and when he switched it on the steady hum filled the air, followed by the rush of water spilling out through the hose into the storm drain nearby. The sound of it was almost soothing, like a stream in the forest, yet underneath it his heart beat fast, not from fear of the act itself but from the knowledge that he was being watched. He glanced up toward the street, and though no lights burned directly, he felt eyes on him, unseen eyes, the kind that hid behind curtains and blinds, the kind that belonged to neighbors too curious to mind their own lives, or worse, to Karen herself, waiting for proof, waiting for a reason to strike harder. He clenched his jaw, focusing instead on the water, watching it swirl, watching the level drop slowly, inch by inch, a small victory that filled him with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in days he felt a sense of control return, as if every drop leaving the pool was another drop of their power draining away, and he whispered under his breath, "This is mine, no one tells me otherwise." Hours passed as the pump continued its steady work, and the night stretched on, the neighborhood silent except for the hum of the motor and the soft rush of water. Occasionally he paused, looking around, listening for footsteps, for voices, for the click of a phone camera, but all he heard was silence, the kind that pressed against his ears until it almost seemed alive. Once he thought he saw a shadow move across the street, a faint figure near Karen's porch, but when he blinked it was gone, leaving only the stillness of the night and the faint rustle of leaves. By dawn the water had dropped enough that the bottom of the pool glimmered faintly, the tiles shining wet under the first light of the morning sun, and though exhaustion weighed on his body, his chest swelled with pride, a silent victory against the words taped to his gate, against the woman across the street who thought she ruled him. He shut off the pump, coiled the hose slowly, deliberately, and returned it to the shed, every movement steady, purposeful, as if daring anyone to confront him now. As he stepped back inside the house, the sky glowing faint pink with sunrise, he noticed it, the faint click of a camera shutter. He froze for a second, his head turning sharply, and through the blinds of his window he caught it. The flicker of a shadow on Karen's porch, the glint of something in her hands, a phone raised, aimed straight at him. His stomach tightened, not with fear but with the confirmation of what he already knew. He had been watched, every moment recorded, every step catalogued for whatever storm she was preparing. He turned away, his jaw clenched, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp with the fire of defiance. He knew what would come next, more letters, louder threats, and maybe worse, but he also knew something deeper now. No matter what she brought, no matter what game she played, he would not bow. This was only the beginning, and as the sun rose higher, spilling light across the drained pool, He whispered to himself, "Let her try, let her bring everything, because I am ready." The morning sun rose sharp and hot, its light spilling over the roofs of the quiet houses, and the man stood at his kitchen window staring out at the drained pool, the bottom tiles exposed, still wet from the night's work, a strange satisfaction warming his chest even as the heaviness of little sleep pulled at his eyes. But his peace did not last long because he felt it before he even heard it, the sound of footsteps on the path, the heavy purposeful tread of someone who thought they owned the ground they walked on. He stepped onto the porch just as Karen appeared at his gate, her phone clutched in one hand, her clipboard in the other, her chin lifted high, her lips twisted into that familiar smirk that hid something sharper underneath, and without even greeting him she snapped a picture, the click echoing in the still morning air, and said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, "So it's true, you drained your pool without permission, a direct violation of community rules." Her voice carried like a siren, sharp and commanding, drawing eyes from the houses around them, curtains twitching, doors creaking open slightly, neighbors peeking out, some curious, some nervous, all of them waiting for the show that always followed when Karen made a scene. The man's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight as he forced his voice steady. "My pool, my water, I don't need permission to touch it." But Karen only laughed, a high-pitched brittle sound that cut through the air, and she stepped closer, raising the clipboard as if it were a badge of authority, her pen scratching furiously as she said, "You've broken regulations, you've endangered property values. You've gone against the very rules that keep this community standing, and I will not allow it." The man took a step forward, his shadow stretching long across the driveway, his eyes narrowing as he said, "You don't own me," and for a moment the words hung there between them like sparks. But then she leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear, her eyes sharp and unblinking, "I warned you, and now you'll pay." His chest tightened, fury and unease colliding, because in her tone was not just arrogance but promise, the kind of promise that carried real weight, and before he could respond she turned abruptly, her voice rising again for the neighbors to hear, declaring that fines would be issued immediately, that the board would pursue legal action if necessary, that this kind of defiance could not stand. Some neighbors shook their heads quietly, others pulled their curtains tighter, unwilling to be seen, but a few lingered at the edge of their lawns, whispering to one another, their eyes flicking between Karen's raised clipboard and the man's clenched fists, and though they said nothing, he could feel their judgment, their fear, the way Karen thrived on making everyone her silent jury. The man's wife stepped out then, calm and quiet, her face steady as always, her eyes flicking once at the clipboard, once at Karen, before settling on her husband, and her voice was soft but firm, "Don't give her what she wants." Karen snapped her head toward her, her lips curling, her words dripping with venom as she spat. "You think you're clever ignoring the rules, but you'll learn soon enough. The law will be at your door," and she snapped another photo, her phone angled deliberately toward the drained pool, capturing the evidence she thought would seal her victory. The man's blood boiled but his wife's hand touched his arm lightly, holding him steady, and he stayed silent, his eyes locked on Karen's smirk until she finally turned sharply on her heel, storming back across the street with the swagger of someone convinced she had won. As she disappeared onto her porch, the murmurs of neighbors rose again. Drifting across the street, sharp and uncertain, some questioning, some agreeing, all of them tangled in the net of her words, and the man felt the weight of their stares pressing into him, heavier than stone. He stepped back into the house slowly, his chest still tight, and from the window he watched Karen pacing her porch, her phone at her ear, her voice raised, sharp, urgent, and though he couldn't hear every word, he caught enough. Police, violation, action. His stomach dropped, his anger twisting into something colder, because now he understood the truth. She wasn't just bluffing. She wasn't just waving papers in the air to scare him. She was moving, making calls, dragging others into the battle, and the pool that should have been nothing more than water and tile had become a weapon in her hands. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands, the echo of her promise still burning in his ears, and though his wife's calm presence beside him steadied his breath, the thought of flashing lights pulling up outside his gate gnawed at his mind, and he knew this was no longer just about a warning slip, no longer just about a drained pool. This was war, and Karen had made her next move. The man barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes he saw Karen smirk, heard her sharp voice repeating the same threat. The law will be at your door, and though he told himself it was nonsense, that no police would waste their time on something as petty as draining a pool, the weight of her certainty clung to him like a shadow. He sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, his coffee cold in his hands, staring at the silent backyard where the drained pool reflected the pale dawn sky, when a sound pierced the quiet, a low hum, followed by a flash of red and blue against the wall. His chest tightened instantly, his breath catching in his throat as he rushed to the window, and there it was, a police cruiser parked just outside the gate, its lights spinning silently, the engine rumbling. For a moment he couldn't move, frozen in disbelief, until another sound reached him, the shuffle of feet on gravel, voices low but firm, and then the sharp knock on the gate, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the morning stillness. His wife appeared behind him, calm as ever, her face unreadable, her voice steady as she said, "They're here," just as she promised. He opened the door slowly, his pulse racing, and stepped onto the porch where two officers stood at the gate, their uniforms neat, their faces serious, and across the street, as he expected, Karen stood proudly on her porch, her arms crossed, her phone raised like a trophy, neighbors gathering one by one, whispering, pointing, the whole street awake and drawn into the spectacle. One officer cleared his throat, his voice firm but not unkind as he said, "Sir, we've received a report of a violation. Complaints about unsafe water disposal and potential hazards from draining your pool. We need to ask you a few questions." The man's fists clenched, anger rising hot in his chest. But before he could speak, Karen cut in from across the street, her voice shrill and triumphant. "See, I told you he was breaking rules, ignoring community safety. He thinks he's above all of us. Arrest him if you have to." The officer turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening at the interruption. But he did not respond to her, his eyes steady on the man, waiting for an answer. The man's breath came hard, his voice low but sharp as he said, "This is my pool, my water, on my property. I broke no laws." The officer nodded slowly, scribbling something in a small notebook, and asked where the drained water had gone, whether it had flooded neighboring yards or caused damage, and the man gestured sharply to the storm drain at the edge of his property. His voice steady now, "No damage, no hazard, it's within city rules, you can check yourself." The second officer walked over, crouching near the drain, running a hand over the dry pavement, and after a moment he gave a small nod to his partner. "No flooding, no issue here." The crowd of neighbors shifted uneasily, their whispers growing louder, and the man saw some of them glance toward Karen with doubt, suspicion creeping into their eyes, and Karen's smirk faltered slightly though she quickly raised her phone higher, her voice desperate now as she shouted, "You don't understand. He violated the HOA rules, he disobeyed me. This is a community violation." Her words cracked, not as sharp as before, and the officer finally turned toward her, his voice calm but stern. "HOA rules are not state law. We're here for public safety, not to enforce neighborhood politics." Gasps rippled through the crowd, neighbors leaning closer to one another, some even chuckling softly, and Karen's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to argue but found no words strong enough to push back against the badge staring her down. The man stood taller now, his chest swelling with a strange mix of relief and pride, his wife stepping forward quietly, her eyes steady as she said, "Thank you, officers, we have nothing to hide," and her calmness cut sharper than any anger, silencing Karen completely. The officers exchanged a glance, then gave a curt nod, one of them saying, "We'll file this as resolved, no violations found, but we'll also be noting the false complaint," and his eyes flicked briefly toward Karen, whose face twisted in panic, her phone dropping slightly as the reality of her own trap closed around her. The neighbors murmured louder now, some shaking their heads, others whispering openly about her obsession, and the man knew the tide had shifted, the power she had carried in their silence beginning to crack. As the officers returned to their cruiser and drove off, the flashing lights fading into the distance, the street remained buzzing with whispers, but now the eyes on him were not full of suspicion. They were filled with curiosity, even respect, while the eyes on Karen were sharp, questioning, the same neighbors who once bowed their heads now turning them away from her porch. The man stepped back inside, his wife closing the door behind them, and he sank into a chair, his breath heavy, his hands still trembling, but in his chest burned something new, the certainty that the war was no longer his alone, that the neighborhood itself had begun to see the truth, and Karen's reign of fear had been cracked by her own hand. The days after the police visit were different in the neighborhood. The man could feel it in the way people looked at him and his wife when they passed. No longer with suspicion or silent judgment but with curiosity, even a quiet respect, as if they had seen through a crack in the wall that Karen had built around herself for years. But Karen, she felt it too, and it gnawed at her like a wound she couldn't heal, her power slipping like sand through her fingers, and instead of stepping back she grew louder, more desperate, determined to prove she still ruled. The man noticed her the very next morning pacing her porch with a phone pressed tight to her ear. Her voice carrying across the street, sharp and frantic, words like violation and legal action repeated again and again. Her free hand waving in wild gestures as if she was speaking to an invisible jury. By noon new notices appeared, taped not only to his gate but also slipped into his mailbox, crammed under his doormat, even tucked into the wipers of his car, each one more aggressive than the last, accusing him of endangering property values, of violating health codes, of setting a bad example for the community, each stamped with the HOA seal as if that gave them weight. He collected them silently, stacking them on the table in neat piles, each one a testament to her desperation. And though his anger boiled, he kept his composure, remembering the way his wife had placed her hand on his arm, reminding him not to give Karen what she wanted. But the neighbors noticed too, and whispers grew louder, some daring to speak within earshot now. Why is she still harassing him? Didn't the police already clear it? Doesn't she have anything better to do? And these murmurs reached Karen like daggers. She responded the only way she knew how, by doubling down. At the next HOA meeting, the man and his wife sat quietly at the back while Karen stood at the front, her face flushed, her voice rising, waving her clipboard as she shouted about community pride and safety, about rules and order, her eyes flicking again and again toward them as if daring them to challenge her. But the room was not the same as before. The neighbors didn't sit silent in fearful obedience. They shifted in their chairs, some frowned, some whispered openly, and when Karen declared that draining a pool was equivalent to vandalism, a man in the front row actually laughed, shaking his head, saying loudly, "That's nonsense," and the ripple of agreement that followed made Karen falter. Her eyes widened, her face twisting, but she tried again, raising her voice louder, insisting that if rules were ignored the neighborhood would collapse into chaos. But another neighbor spoke, sharper this time. "What rules? Karen. The police said there was no violation. Why are you wasting everyone's time?" Gasps filled the room, heads turned, and Karen's face drained of color as she sputtered, trying to find an answer. But the murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping, questions rising, and for the first time the power of her voice was drowned out by the sound of others. The man sat still, his wife calm beside him, watching as the queen of the board flailed in her own court, her desperation exposed, her authority unraveling, and though part of him wanted to stand, to shout, to end it there, he knew there was no need. She was unraveling without his help. By the end of the meeting she stormed out, her papers crumpled in her fists, her heels clattering angrily against the floor, and the neighbors followed her with eyes full not of fear but of contempt, some shaking their heads, others whispering openly, and the man felt the shift solidify, the tide turning completely. That night Karen returned to her porch, pacing in frantic circles, her phone lighting up again and again as she made calls deep into the night, her voice shrill and cracked, and though he could not hear every word the tone told him everything. She was losing, she knew it, and she was desperate to claw back what had already slipped beyond her reach. The man stood at his window watching her, his fists loose at his sides now, his anger replaced by something colder, calmer, the satisfaction of seeing her cage close in around her, and beside him his wife stood silent, her eyes steady, her lips curved into the faintest smile as she whispered, "She's doing our work for us." Across the street Karen stopped pacing for a moment, her shoulders slumped, her phone lowered, her face turned toward their house with a look no longer smug but hollow, and the man realized that her war was not with the pool anymore, it was with herself, with the crumbling power she could not accept was gone, and as he stepped away from the window, he knew the worst was yet to come, because desperate people make desperate moves, and Karen was not finished falling. The next morning the man stepped outside expecting another paper taped to his gate, another empty threat from Karen, but what he found was worse. 3 new envelopes stuffed into his mailbox, each thicker, stamped with bold letters, and when he tore them open his hands tightened around the paper, each letter more aggressive than the last, accusing him not only of draining his pool without permission but of creating public health hazards, of damaging the community's water system, even of endangering children. He laughed bitterly under his breath because the words were nonsense, pure fiction, But the tone was different, darker, more desperate, and as he turned his head across the street he saw Karen standing on her porch again. Her eyes locked on him, her phone in her hand, her lips curling into that strained smile that no longer carried confidence but still tried to mask her unraveling. She raised her phone deliberately, snapping a picture as he held the papers, her voice calling across the street. "Keep ignoring them. I've already called the authorities. They'll handle what you refuse to obey." His chest burned, his fists clenching at his sides, but before he could speak his wife stepped to the doorway, calm as always, her gaze sweeping over Karen without a word, and that silence seemed to cut sharper than anything, because Karen's face flushed, her voice cracking as she shouted again, louder this time. "You think you're above us, but you'll see when the police come back." The man turned and went inside, tossing the letters onto the table with the others. The pile now so thick it looked absurd, a mountain of empty threats. But his heart pounded faster, not because of the words but because he knew she wasn't bluffing. She had already dragged police once, and she would do it again, no matter how foolish it made her look. Hours later he heard it, the low hum of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel, and his stomach tightened as he pulled the curtain back to see another patrol car rolling slowly down the street. Neighbors emerged quickly, as if drawn by the sound, whispering, pointing, and across the street Karen lit up, rushing down her porch steps waving her arms, her voice shrill as she flagged the car down. Here, this is the house, you need to see what is done." The officer stepped out, looking tired, already irritated, his eyes narrowing as he glanced from Karen to the man's gate. And when he spoke his tone was firm but weary. "We already came here last week. The issue was resolved. There's nothing illegal happening." Karen's face twisted, her hands shaking as she waved her clipboard, her phone, shouting about violations, about danger, about disrespect for the HOA. But the officer cut her off. His voice sharper now. "HOA rules are not enforceable laws. Stop wasting police resources. This is the last time." Gasps rippled through the watching crowd, neighbors whispering louder now, their eyes hard on Karen, some even shaking their heads, and for the first time she looked around and saw not silence but judgment. Faces no longer hiding behind curtains but glaring openly, fed up with her antics. The man stepped onto his porch then, his arms crossed, his eyes steady, saying nothing, because there was no need. The sight of Karen stumbling, stammering, her power slipping in front of everyone was enough. His wife stood beside him calm and unshaken, and when the officer finally returned to his car without even glancing back, Karen was left standing in the middle of the street, her phone limp in her hand, her face pale, her breath uneven, the weight of the neighbor's stares crushing her from all sides. Slowly she turned, storming back toward her porch, slamming her door so hard the sound echoed. But the damage was done. The whispers rose louder, bolder, spreading like wildfire. "She's gone too far. She's lost it. She's embarrassing us all." The man returned inside, his chest lighter now, the storm inside him cooling into something calmer, because he could feel it. The tide had shifted completely. Karen was no longer feared. She was becoming a joke, a warning of what happens when power turns to obsession. That night the street was alive with murmurs, neighbors talking in small groups, some laughing softly when her name came up. And though Karen's lights burned late, her shadow pacing frantic circles, she never stepped outside, not once, not even to glare. The man sat with his wife on the porch, the air cool, the quiet broken only by the sound of crickets, and he whispered softly, "It's over for her," and his wife, calm and steady as ever, replied, "Not yet, but soon." Across the street Karen's house looked darker, smaller, her throne collapsing, and the man knew now it was only a matter of time before she lost everything. The following days felt different. The man noticed it not only in the way the neighbors carried themselves but in the sudden cracks showing in Karen's empire. The same empire that had once ruled the street with silence and fear. He saw it first at the clubhouse where the HOA usually gathered in loud voices and smug laughter. But now the parking lot sat nearly empty, only one or two cars instead of the usual line. And when he lingered nearby he caught fragments of raised voices drifting through the walls, not strength but desperation. Karen's shrill tone echoed above the rest, accusing her own board members of betrayal, of cowardice. Her words frantic as she demanded they stand with her. While another voice, tired and angry, snapped back that she had embarrassed them all by calling the police twice for nothing, that her obsession had turned the whole community against them. The man didn't need to step inside to know what was happening. Her allies were slipping away, her throne crumbling piece by piece. That evening he sat on his porch with his wife, sipping quietly, and they both watched as one of the board members who used to parade around with Karen avoided her house completely. Walking quickly down the street with his head down, his face tight, his steps hurried like a man escaping shame. The next day another member drove past without so much as a glance toward her porch, his car speeding away as if being near her was poison. And the neighbors noticed. People who once stood quiet behind curtains now gathered in small clusters at the mailboxes, at the sidewalks, their voices no longer whispers but sharp questions. Why is she still harassing them? Didn't the police already clear it? Why should one woman control all of us? Karen heard them too, and her desperation showed. She stormed down the street one afternoon, clipboard clutched in her shaking hands, knocking on doors, her voice rising as she begged for support, insisting that the neighborhood would collapse without her, that the man and his wife were dangerous rule-breakers who threatened everything. But one by one doors closed in her face, neighbors muttered excuses, some even told her flatly that she had gone too far. Each rejection made her voice shriller, her hands tighter around her papers, until she stood in the middle of the street shouting like a wild bird with no one listening, her words scattering into the air with no power left to catch them. The man watched all of it from his porch, his wife at his side, her face calm, her eyes steady, and when he asked softly if it was ending now she shook her head once, her lips curving into the faintest smile, not yet, but soon. The next HOA meeting sealed it. The room was packed, more neighbors than he had ever seen attend, their faces hard, their voices restless, and Karen stood at the front trying to shout over them, waving her clipboard like a shield, but her words no longer silenced the crowd. Instead questions fired back at her one after another, sharp and unrelenting. Why did you lie? Why did you waste police time? Why did you target them over a pool? What gave you the right to shame us all? Karen's face twisted, her smirk gone, her hands trembling as she tried to answer. But the voices kept coming, louder, angrier, until she cracked, her voice breaking into stammers, her papers falling from her grip as her own board members sat silently behind her, their faces pale, their loyalty gone. The man sat at the back with his wife, both silent, both steady, and he felt a strange satisfaction watching Karen's empire collapse not from his hands but from her own arrogance, her own desperation tearing her down piece by piece. When she finally stormed out of the room, shoulders slumped, face red with humiliation, the murmurs of the neighbors followed her, not fearful but mocking, some even laughing quietly, and the man knew the tide had shifted completely. That night Karen's lights burned late again, her shadow pacing wildly behind the curtains, her phone lighting up her face as she made frantic calls that no one answered, and the man realized she was now trapped in the cage she had built, isolated, abandoned, a queen with no crown, no court, no power. He leaned back in his chair on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his face, and whispered, "She's finished," and his wife, calm and certain as always, replied, "She just doesn't know it yet." The next meeting was different from the start. The man felt it as soon as he and his wife walked through the clubhouse doors, the air thick with tension, the room packed wall to wall with neighbors who normally never came, their voices buzzing in low murmurs, their eyes sharp and restless. Chairs scraped, papers rustled, but the noise was not the usual board shuffle of routine. It was the sound of a crowd ready for something to break. Karen sat at the front table clutching her clipboard like it was the last shield she had left. Her face pale but her eyes wild, darting across the room as if she could still command silence by sheer force. But silence didn't come. Instead, the murmurs grew louder until she banged her pen against the table, snapping at everyone to sit down, to show respect, her voice high and shaky, and the room stilled not from obedience but from the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. She began to speak, her words fast and frantic, insisting again that draining the pool was a danger to the community, that she had only acted to protect everyone, that she had been right to involve the police, but her voice no longer carried weight. Faces in the crowd twisted with frustration. Heads shook openly, whispers rose sharper. A neighbor near the front interrupted her, his voice strong. "Why should we believe you? The police said no laws were broken." And another voice followed quickly, louder. "What gives you the right to waste our time and drag us into your personal war?" Karen's lips trembled as she tried to shout them down, but her words stumbled, breaking under the growing roar of questions. The man watched from the back, his chest tight with anticipation, and then he felt his wife rise beside him. She stood slowly, her presence commanding the room before she even spoke, and all at once the noise faded, heads turning, voices falling, as every eye locked on her. Even Karen froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening, her face draining of color as if she already knew what was coming. The wife walked calmly down the aisle, each step steady, her posture tall, and when she reached the front she turned to face the crowd, her voice clear and calm but carrying through the room with a weight that silence could not resist. "I have listened quietly long enough," she said, "but it is time the truth is spoken." The room leaned in, the man holding his breath as her words filled the air. She spoke of the harassment, the endless notices, the false accusations, the humiliation dragged through the neighborhood not for safety but for ego. She explained how rules had been twisted into weapons, how authority had been abused, and then she turned, her eyes locking on Karen, sharp and unflinching, and her voice cut like a blade. "The law is not your toy, and power is not your right." Gasps spread through the room, neighbors nodding, some clapping softly until the sound grew louder, a wave of agreement rising against the woman who once ruled them. Karen's face crumpled, her mouth opening and closing, her hands shaking as she tried to raise her clipboard, but the gesture looked pathetic, empty, and no words came out strong enough to silence the room. The wife reached into her bag then and pulled out an envelope, thick and official, sealed with the authority that Karen had pretended to wield. She laid it flat on the table before the board and spoke again, calm, certain. "I am not only your neighbor, I am a sitting judge in this district, and I have watched long enough as power has been abused here. This harassment ends now." The room erupted. Gasps turned to cheers, whispers turned to shouts of approval, some neighbors even rising to clap openly, and Karen stumbled back a step, her clipboard slipping from her hands, her phone dropping onto the table with a hollow thud. Her eyes darted around the room searching for support, but the other board members looked away, their faces pale, their loyalty gone, and the neighbors who once bowed their heads under her glare now stared at her with open contempt. Karen tried to speak, tried to stammer out a denial, but the crowd drowned her out, voices overlapping, calling for her resignation, demanding the board be replaced, their anger no longer hidden but unleashed. She shook her head wildly, her hands trembling, her face red, and then she turned abruptly, shoving past chairs, storming toward the door as voices chased her, mocking, furious, relentless. The man sat in the back, his chest swelling with pride as he watched his wife stand tall at the center of it all, not with arrogance but with quiet, unshakable strength, and he knew this was the moment Karen's reign ended, not with fists or shouting, but with the truth laid bare for everyone to see. That night the neighborhood buzzed with stories, voices carrying down the street, laughter spilling from porches as people recounted the sight of Karen stumbling out, defeated and small, and across the street her house sat dark, her curtains drawn, her porch empty, no phone raised, no smirk waiting. The man sat beside his wife on their porch, the cool night air brushing against them, and he whispered softly, "You ended it tonight," and she turned to him with that calm, faint smile, replying, "I didn't end it. She did, I only showed them who she really was." And as they sat there in the quiet, the street at peace for the first time in weeks, the man knew Part 9 would not be about war anymore but about consequences, the kind that linger long after the battle is done. The silence after the storm was the loudest sound the neighborhood had ever known. The man felt it the morning after the meeting when he stepped outside and saw the street in a way he had never seen before, peaceful, almost free. No one rushing back behind curtains when Karen appeared. No one glancing nervously at her porch, because for the first time her porch was empty, her throne abandoned. He stood there for a moment, taking it in, the faint chirp of birds, the sound of a lawnmower starting 2 houses down, voices of children playing without hesitation, and he realized it was not just another day, it was a new beginning, a change that had been waiting beneath the surface for years but only now had broken free. His wife joined him quietly, her presence steady, her face calm as always, but he saw the difference in her eyes too. The way she looked at the street as if it had finally taken its first deep breath after holding it far too long. Across the road Karen's curtains were still drawn, the windows dark, her car unmoved, and whispers had already begun spreading through the neighbors. "She hasn't come out. She hasn't said a word. Maybe she's leaving. Maybe she can't face us anymore." The man knew the truth. They had all seen her break, seen the crown fall from her head, and there was no recovering from that. That afternoon the HOA board tried to meet again, but only 2 members showed up, sitting awkwardly in the half-empty clubhouse until neighbors arrived and demanded answers, their voices sharper, stronger than before. The 2 board members muttered apologies, blaming Karen, insisting they hadn't agreed with her actions. But the crowd cut them down with cold stares and angry words, and by the end of the hour both had resigned, slipping away like rats from a sinking ship, leaving the board in ruins. For the first time the community gathered not in fear but in choice. Neighbors who had never spoken openly before now stood in small groups in the clubhouse, debating, questioning, suggesting what could be built from the ashes of Karen's control. And the man sat silently at the back, listening, until they all turned to his wife. She rose calmly, her presence commanding the room without effort. And though her words were few they carried weight. Rules should protect, not punish. Community should mean trust, not fear. And every nod, every clap of agreement told her she was no longer just one voice among many. She was the one they all looked to now. Karen tried one last move days later, appearing suddenly on her porch as neighbors passed, shouting about legal rights, about how the HOA couldn't survive without her. But no one stopped, no one listened. Her words bounced off their backs like pebbles thrown against stone. And when she screamed louder her voice cracked, her throat raw, until she retreated inside, slamming her door, the sound more like defeat than defiance. From that day forward her house became a hollow shell. The woman who once controlled everything reduced to a shadow pacing behind curtains, while the street outside grew alive with something it had not seen in years, unity. Neighbors laughed again, helped each other without fear of fines. Children played without being shushed. And the man felt the change deep in his chest every time he stepped outside, lighter, freer, stronger. One evening as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, the man sat on his porch with his wife, the street calm and beautiful, and he turned to her, his voice soft. "You ended it. You gave them their lives back." She shook her head gently, her lips curving into that faint knowing smile, and said, "I only revealed what was already true. Power built on fear never lasts." He watched her for a long moment, pride swelling in his chest, knowing that while the neighborhood now saw her as their guide, their protector, to him she was more. She was the reason he had not broken, the reason Karen's storm had not drowned him. Across the street Karen's house remained dark, the symbol of a reign that had collapsed under its own weight, and the man knew her downfall was complete, not because anyone had shouted her down, but because she had been stripped bare before the eyes of everyone she once controlled, and they would never forget it. And so the street moved on, not under fear but under respect, and though the memory of the battles lingered like scars, the man found peace in knowing those scars were proof of victory, proof of survival, proof that no matter how loud a tyrant shouted, truth would always echo louder in the end.